Good evening and welcome to the channel's studios here in London with your international news around the world in 5. President Volodymyr Zelensky has been warmly welcomed at the first ever NATO meeting attended by Ukraine.
Welcome to this first meeting of the NATO-Ukraine Council. This is truly a historic moment, allies and Ukraine sitting side by side as equals to address our common vision of Euro-Atlantic security.
NATO boss Jens Stoltenberg says Ukraine is closer to NATO than ever before and said Ukraine will become a member without specifying a specific timeline. It comes after Zelensky criticised NATO for what he sees as delays in admitting the country to the alliance. Japanese and South Korean officials say North Korea has fired a suspected intercontinental ballistic missile. The long-range missile flew for more than an hour before landing short of Japanese waters on Wednesday morning. Pyongyang's launch comes after it threatened retaliation against what it said were recent US spy plane incursions over its territory. Earlier this week, it threatened to shoot down such planes. Washington has dismissed the accusations, saying its military patrols are in line with international law. Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas has visited the West Bank city of Jenin days after 3 of his senior officials were forced to flee a funeral by crowds furious at their response to an Israeli assault days earlier. The 87-year-old, who has rebuffed pressure to step down, visited the cemetery where the funeral was held at the entrance of the Jenin refugee camp. Flanked by his special presidential guards, he addressed the crowds at the edge of the camp, which has witnessed the biggest Israeli operation in the occupied West Bank in 20 years. He told cheering crowds that the camp will be rebuilt. Banned protests have taken place in Kenya, with police firing tear gas at crowds gathered at grounds in the capital Nairobi, where opposition veteran Raila Odinga was expected to address his supporters. Demonstrators in the slums say they are angered by President William Ruto's government. The government says tax hikes, which include a doubling of the fuel tax and introduction of a levy to fund affordable housing, will raise an extra 200 billion Kenyan shillings a year and are needed to deal with growing debt repayments and to fund job creation initiatives. At least 6 people were killed last Friday during protests against the taxes.
Again, you see, like young guys, they were crying that they promised, Mr. President, you promised them that you are going to help them, but you didn't. Again, Mama Mboga. So we are just crying, we love you, but we are crying if you can help us.
Despite the protests, Iran's President Ebrahim Raisi has received a red carpet welcome from Kenyan counterpart William Ruto as he began a 3-country tour of Africa that Tehran has touted as a new beginning in relations with the continent. Raisi's trip to Africa, which will also take him to Uganda and Zimbabwe, is the first by an Iranian president in more than a decade and represents a bid to diversify economic ties in the face of crippling US sanctions. At a press briefing after meeting William Ruto, Raisi said he wanted to boost commercial ties with African countries. Eyewitness video shows flash floods in the southern Russian town of Nebug after heavy rains and high winds hit the region. The footage shows cars being carried as floodwaters stream down the streets in the city. Hundreds of people have reportedly been evacuated as torrential rains caused flash flooding in the area, with rising water levels affecting towns and small villages. The flooding has caused some damage to properties, but there have been no immediate reports of injuries or fatalities. And among the solemn and serious talks of NATO, there have been a few jokes and smiles. Neither the UK nor Australian Prime Minister could resist adding to the competitive climate between the country's cricket fans during their bilateral meeting. Both came armed with gifts to exchange, but also took the opportunity to remind one another of the oldest and fiercest rivalry in the sport. And that's your international news around the world in 5. Now back to the channel's studios in Lagos.